I'm not suggesting there's an easy answer to that, but it may well be that this particular bit of kit, and I suppose I can call myself that, I can at least call it a little bit, having designed it in the first place. It may well be that this thing is inferring it needs a little bit more work done than you would otherwise do if you had a different style of drill, but hence some of the conversations we've been having through this. Right, so what I would like to do now, if you can put up with me for another few minutes, is to talk about how we can measure, assess soil carbon a little bit. This is soil carbon. This isn't getting to net zero totally. This is the carbon in our soils, which predominantly and essentially is very important, and it makes up organic matter and resilience and everything else. So I'm going to think about soil carbon. We think about how we measure it. And I'm using an algorithm here from America. Why am I doing that? Well, there's a number of reasons. I'll go through why I've used, they call it Russell 2, not Russell 2. It's available freely to download if you're a farmer in the States, because they're like that over there. They sling stuff at you. They've thrown a lot of money at it. So you can do that, and you can put all of your rotations through this algorithm, the whole idea of this, and you can start to work out the effect that this has on revised universal soil loss equation, it stands for. So the implication of this originally, it came from well before the 70s when they started to look at it, but it's been proven since the 70s. It's one reason I went for it, because it's not just a recent thing, it's been going for ages. The original driver was, we want to reduce our soil losses. We've all heard of the Dust Bowl, and that's really where this started. The intensive tillage, destabilised soils, whatever else. It's capable of assessing the potential for soil loss, clearly, but also the percentage annual change in soil carbon. I will come back onto that in due course. The reason I think it's worth looking at is because it accounts for nearly everything we do on the farm. The rotations, the crop biomass, all elements of tillage, our soil type, the climate, every input, including whether we grow cover crops, how we actually manage the cover crop, do we graze them, etc. So it counts for all of that. I haven't been able to find yet, and I've open ears with regard to the science that's going to come in a moment, I haven't been able to find an algorithm that accounts for just that many of these things. I believe we need to account for everything in this, otherwise it's not giving us the full picture. That's another reason why I've used it. We're assessing it under UK conditions. Having started the work, to cut a long story short, because we haven't got time, the USDA have helped me to do this. I've helped them, giving them data. Clearly, if you went online and downloaded this thing, you'd hit a stumbling block. Number one would be, it'd ask you where you farm. What's your US county and state? You have to put that in. Why does it ask you that? Well, because it needs to then drag in all of the soil information, all of the climate information that's associated with that particular area you're farming. Bit of an issue when we're over in the UK, isn't it? So initially I found an area in the States that was nearly the same as ours, although it's nowhere near, and it showed a positive correlation. So talking to these guys, they said, well, we'll make you some UK counties and states if you want, if you can give us the climate information, the soil information. That's where it's come from. So I'm now working this in UK climate soil conditions. So I've applied it with Andrew's help, and what, about 3 hours of faffing about one day to get all of the detail from you. It was painful, wasn't it?
Yeah,
really? But,
yeah.
all of the information
Worth it.
Rotations, applied it. So quickly, without spending ages, this is Andrew's traditional 4-course glebe heavyland rotation, which has got 4 crops in it: winter wheat, sugar beet, wheat and oilseed rape on this particular field. We put in all of the tillage operations. I had to create some, this is my part of the involvement with this exercise with the USDA, I had to create some UK-based soil cultivations. They didn't understand what a solo was, they didn't understand what a sumo trio was. They certainly, when I've gone into potatoes and sugar beet, whatever else, didn't understand what a de-stoner was. They don't farm land you need to de-stone in the States, they just get somewhere you don't need to do it. But they needed to understand all of that, but they're very intensive operations. So we've also had to put in how much sewage cake you put on. the terminology manure was what theirs was. We've put in the details for Andrews and his tonnage, his applied, etc., etc. Every operation's had to go in there. Andrews' newer, progressively moving on to rotation on the heavier soils is a 6-course rotation. It took us even longer to do this. And we've got in here the same sort of inputs. We've got different crops, clearly. We've got the yields have to go in because that's then going to be the feed for the biomass that's actually put into these soils. And I've got Andrews, for example, just quickly to show you here, the current heath rotation. We've got manure going on, we've got cover crops in. They need to know how much the cover crop biomass yield is when it's drilled. We need to know if we harvest any of these crops, how much residue is returned. We need to know the stubble height. There's lots of stuff that needs to be put in. The upshot of all of this, the key results, why you've had to live with all that blather to get you to this point. If we think about, I'll just take that back one for a moment. If we think about what it gives us, a few selected key things it will work through as the whole rotation are, is number one, the soil tillage intensity rating, or STIR. The Yanks love acronyms, I think they are called. So soil tillage intensity rate, it works out for the entire amount of cultivations that have gone in what your intensity rating is. The higher the rating, the more intense the soil movement is, therefore it can start within the algorithm to work out what's happening to the carbon. We also need, having put all the yields in, ultimately it will come down to, with the appropriate area of the country, climate and everything else, it will work out what they call the soil conditioning index. When I first started this, I was really interested in tillage intensity until I got speaking to the guy and said, well, why do you really want to know that? Well, I think that's got a lot to do with soil carbon. What you really need to understand, you said, is the total picture. In order to do that, you've got to understand what the soil conditioning index is. Live with me, it will all become clear. So I've put in Andrew's traditional rotation, lead. I've put what he's now moving to, certainly on the field we looked at. You can see we've got a tillage intensity of nearly 100 at 87. That's reduced to 66. We've got a soil conditioning index that's gone up from 1.16 to 1.39. This means nothing to you at the moment. Live with me, it will all make sense in a moment. If we move, and I put in, just for interest, your early pictures, what you would have done. A plough, combi, straw removed, no cover crops, no muck put back, a traditionalist, very intensive cultivation. You can see here we've got even higher on the tillage intensity, and we've reduced even more the conditioning index. Did the same for the glebe. Sorry, the heath, the light land. I put in Andrew's current light land rotation in its entirety, as I showed you. And I also put in the same rotation, identically, but accepting a 70% yield, so a 30% yield dip. Thinking that there's a lot of speak these days, oh, well, we can accept lower yields because our input costs have gone down. So I just, for the hell of it, put in identical rotation, all the parameters except a 30% yield reduction. It's a fairly big hit on yield, I accept that. So the soil condition, the stirs were the same because the tillage intensities were no different, but the soil conditioning index has gone from just under 1 to 0.67. So it's gone down a lot in terms of SCI. The effect just of reducing yield there. I also put in a plough and combi type of rotation on those soils as well. Higher tillage intensity and a vastly reduced soil conditioning index. And for the hell of it, I thought I'd also put in a very intensive roots operation. If you could do it, not that I'm saying you would, but plough, subsoil, bed form, bed till, de-stone deep as part of potatoes, and then the intervening crops. So this is hugely intensive. You can see we've nearly doubled. We've got over 200 stir on this tillage intensity. Our soil conditioning index is now flagging up red. It was yellow here when we were going more traditional. It's now flagged up as red because it's gone negative. The reason that that's important is when they found with this algorithm what really happens if you've got a positive soil conditioning index, well positive, then we should be on average seeing an annual percentage increase in soil carbon as a result of those practices. If we're around zero, we're probably marking time. We're either gaining or losing. If we go negative, we're losing. So we're on a, I would say, unsustainable from the point of view of soil carbon situation. That's not going to be long-term possible to farm like. So, sorry about this graph, but live with me, it all becomes clear. So that's saying what I just have. Here we've got soil conditioning index on the vertical, we've got 0 here. So here we've got a positive soil conditioning, here we've got a negative. I've put the points on the regression line, which is quite encouraging, and it's quite impressive, the correlation coefficients here. But anyway, these are for points predominantly in the US, hence my involvement with this, to look at how this is now panning out in the UK, and it has to be said very positively. If we go negative on the soil conditioning, we go negative on the percentage annual change in carbon. We're declining, like I said. If we're positive, and the green here would give us the most two positives, over and above the heath, why is that? Soil type. Heavier soils tend to hold on to organic carbon better than lighter soils. So we've got a greater positive effect on those, and all the intervening ones in the middle. What this does then is with Andrew's heath rotation here, 100% of his yield, or down to 70% of yield, it shows us the importance of yield in all of this, because we've actually got a far lower likelihood that we've got a positive annual change in carbon. I can't be any more precise than that. The government would want numbers, sorry, the authorities would want numbers on all of this, wouldn't they? What is your actual figure? How close can we get? It depends entirely where we start from. It depends on the season. It depends where you are in the rotation. At best, I'm comfortable with discussing a percentage annual change with you, because it's a trend, basically. It takes away some of those finite things. So, did that make some sort of sense? So, key messages. I would suggest, in the light of what we're finding at Andrews, but generally as well, if we've got a very highly flexible rotation that's capable of being tweaked, tuned according to conditions, and we can continue to grow roots through soil, we need to those roots growing through our soil are piling in carbon, but they're also piling in resilience and structure. If we've got poor yields, we've got poorer root systems, we've got a problem coming. So we need highly flexible rotation, because it's going to give added security for that soil carbon. It's going to give us capability to control blackgrass, because we've got those spring breaks in the rotation, the ability to be able to manage that particular bird, in addition to all the good work you do, and in your case, Andrew, in terms of the hand roading work. We know if we reduce tillage intensity, we're going to be putting less energy into the cultivations we have to do on the soil. So we're going to get, in theory and in practice, improved field efficiency, which is another part of the carbon equation which you'll learn about in a moment. A more traditional intensive tillage, such as the sorts I showed you, at best is going to be, we would say, sustaining, more likely declining soil carbon levels. But removing straw increases the chance of that becoming more unsustainable, because we're losing some of that carbon going back in. If we remove it, put it back as muck or whatever. If we return manure or sludge cake, clearly that's positive, because we're enhancing those levels. Most importantly, keeping growing roots growing through the soil, massively crucial. If we compromise yield, we're therefore compromising the very elements of something that is trying to structure our soil, roots. We mustn't do that, in my view. If we can avoid unnecessary soil movement, we're going to save money, but we're also going to reduce this tillage intensity, which is important. So think about depth. Think about the speed of operation, think about the type of operation, the amount of soil movement. Is it across the whole field? Is it in strips? Is it localised? Avoid excessive speed. Now, that's probably not what you want to hear, is it? Because potentially we're reducing the output here, but speed tends to imply more intensive soil movement. But make use of those roots growing through the soil to maintain the structure. And metal cultivations, in other words, I would suggest as a means to an end here. Ultimately, roots do the work, but if we can give them pathways, then we're more than likely going to maximise what those roots are doing for us. Good. Well, thank you very much for living with me. I think we'll have questions at the end, will we, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, please, if you could.
Right.
Mike's not working, but anyway, yes, thank you very much, Philip. Excellent. But for time, we've got a question and answer session, so we'll pick up questions a bit later. But to move on to the agenda is Amy. Amy Watkins is our sustainability manager, and she's now going to carry on the carbon question. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you. Good morning, or almost good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Philip, for your presentation. So Philip's really been focusing on the below ground soil carbon. We're now moving on to what happens above ground, relevant to the trials work that's already been discussed today, and also generally around net zero. And from this discussion that I'm going to have with you today is really what I want you to take home is 3 key things that you can be implementing on your farm based on what we will discuss. Some simple steps to help you work towards achieving net zero. But before we go any further, I'm going to put a figure up on the screen. Now this one is used quite commonly throughout the industry. It's relevant to a different greenhouse gas to what we all talk about. So traditionally we always talk about carbon, and we have so far to date already today, but this one's relevant to nitrous oxide. 78% of the UK's nitrous oxide emissions are coming from agriculture. Now that shocks a lot of people. It's quite a significant proportion compared to other industries out there. But this is really why we're getting so much pressure to work towards achieving net zero. Now nitrous oxide, which I'll show you the main sources of that afterwards, but it is the most potent greenhouse gas in the industry, in the world, compared to carbon dioxide. Now, I'd love to ask you all where the main sources of nitrous oxide emissions are in our farming systems. Something that probably the person sat next to you as well will have in common with you on your farm. Every single farmer has it on their land, and that is from soils. So all of these conversations we've been having around direct drilling today in soils, 78%, that nitrous oxide emissions that we're contributing to the UK is majoritarily coming from our soils. Of course, there's an element of nitrogen in there as well, which has a role to play, but what's happening below ground is impacting all of these greenhouse gas emissions. So, moving on from that, I've already said it's not all about carbon. We have 2 other main greenhouse gas emissions associated with agriculture. The first one, of course, being carbon. We only contribute to around 1% of the UK's CO2 emissions. So, in general, majority, it's not actually as significant as nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide is there as well, as I mentioned, soils being the direct factor there, and also methane. There's a lot of chat about methane, particularly in the livestock sector, but that is another one of the main greenhouse gas emissions. So, defining net zero, it's really about having a balance. It's not about eliminating emissions, it's not about complete sequestration, but instead it's about making sure that we are balancing what we're emitting and also what we're taking in from the ground. Defining sequestration then, for those of you who don't know what sequestration is, it's the stuff Philip was mentioning earlier, relevant to soil carbon, but it's also relevant to woodlands as well, hedgerows, anything that can be taking carbon back down from the atmosphere and storing it. Managing emissions really does tie in with a sustainable farming approach. And the main things we'll be talking about today, of course, are cultivations from the trials work we've been doing at Andrews. Also, continuous cover. So cover crops do play, moving on a bit. Cover crops do play a major role in that, making sure that we have permanent roots in the ground to be drawing carbon down. And finally, a key point here, not just for carbon, but also for financial reasons, is nutrient management. So reducing how much nitrogen, as an example, is being lost to the environment, maximising how much is being taken up by the crop. So, the real drivers behind net zero, there's 4 key areas really that's making this a really important factor in the industry at the moment. We have the political challenges. I put the NFU's ambition up there because we are, as an agricultural industry across England and Wales, aiming to be 10 years earlier than the UK standard of 2050, and we're aiming to be net zero by 2040. There's also the 25-year environment plan up there, which is shaping all new policies and frameworks coming out in the UK relevant to net zero. The SFI and ELMS are all based around this 25-year environment plan. Of course, the environmental pressures, I don't probably need to tell you about all of these are all things you'll be familiar with. We've got the wetter winters, and generally we are seeing more rainfall occurring across the UK now, and these are coming in increasingly intense situations too. So in the winter we've got these wetter periods, but also the other end, in summer, we're getting these drier periods. And that causes a lot of challenges for us managing crop production, but also in terms of achieving net zero. Needless to say again, the economic pressures, the market volatility, so the price of nitrogen, the price of fuel that's been changing quite a lot over the past 18 months to 2 years, and will continue to change. Again, another pressure on us in terms of why we should be working towards net zero for greenhouse gas emissions, but also from an economic perspective. And finally, the consumers. So some of you may be more directly related to this than others, but generally we are seeing more coming from consumers, more pressures around achieving net zero. Tesco's have set a target for a lot of their produce to be leaf mark standard by 2030. There's new climate pledges coming out from the likes of Arla as well, of their produce to be carbon neutral or reducing their emissions. And this goes throughout the supply chain. So generally we are going to be asked more and more questions around where are our greenhouse gas emissions coming from and what can we do to reduce them. But what does this actually mean to you guys sat here today? In essence, it's a form of benchmarking. So what you do for carbon is going to be very important for your back pocket as well. There's a common misconception in the industry that you can only optimise for carbon or for yield, whereas in reality, actually the two things come hand in hand. So by optimising for yield, you're naturally going to be improving your greenhouse gas emissions as well, which we'll show you a bit later with some of the results that we've got. So, where do we begin when we start talking about carbon? As I mentioned, there's so many questions in the industry, from how do I measure my soil carbon? Should I be looking to sell it as an example? How do I actually start that benchmarking process? So really, in this talk and my time with you today is to talk around that process of where do you start from? For those of you who have not made any start line at the moment, what do you start collecting in terms of data? Then moving on to the data inputting side. And I'll leave a lot of this to the guys after me who are going to talk around the carbon calculators and how you use those, but just to give you an indication of where do you get the figures from to look at your carbon emissions. Finally then, we'll talk about firstly, soil carbon being that main sequesterer on farms, similar to woodlands. The second one is fuel consumption, so anything that you're using to drill your crop, to establish your crop, right through to harvest. All of those fuel consumptions on the farm will have an impact. And finally, fertiliser usage, which is the big one, and I'll show you that a bit later on, but fertiliser usage is a key element in this. I put down here some basic and more specific data collection options here. So if you're starting from a bare minimum, you haven't got that much data already, as a basic point from your soil carbon, I would recommend anybody here today to start adding soil organic matter tests to their standard soil analysis. It's a very easy basic starting point. That not only gives you results for carbon and net zero reasons, but also for general soil resilience. More specifically, you can look at different pools of carbon, so your organic, your active types of carbon, which the labs do offer tests for, but basic level would really be starting out with your soil organic matter testing. Fertiliser usage, again, is another example. You could get, if you want to look at your whole farm carbon footprint, look at your total tonnage of nitrum, for example, that you brought onto the farm that year and used, or if you want to be even more specific and look at it field by field basis, you need to know your kilograms of nitrogen per hectare that you're applying to that crop. And we've used that as an example in the actual trials work that we've been doing at Andrews. I put some question marks there around cultivations and crop yields. When you look at a whole farm carbon footprint, a lot of people are very confused by these two areas. Cultivations, because in the calculators they don't generally account for what's being released from the soil. When you put cultivations in these calculators, it's really accounting for the fuel that you've used to undertake that cultivation. Reason being is it's very, very difficult to quantify what's happening with soils. It could be use just your fuel consumption there. And finally, crop yields. So generally, if you put a crop yield in a calculator, it will actually show that it's emitting something, which causes a lot of people to question that again. Reason being is you're harvesting that crop, you're taking it off the farm, and it's entering the supply chain. So actually, it's not permanently sequestering in that system. However, what I will show you today is how important yield can be if you're looking on a field-by-field basis. So, when we start that data collection, you have different options of where you go to put that data into a calculator to calculate your carbon footprint. I put an example up here of the Farm Carbon Toolkit. In total, there's about 69 different calculators on the market. So much option and probably not an indication of which direction we should be going in, but there are three main ones that are recognised in the industry for us to be using. Now, the Farm Carbon Toolkit is an example of one of them. All of these are free to use, but this one is probably the most user-friendly one that I've come across so far, in a way of, putting in the data into a spreadsheet, and then you put that into an actual online database, and it will put out a report at the end which breaks down where your emissions are coming from. But again, I'll leave that to the guys afterwards to talk around the different types of tools available and which one they've decided to use out of the two. So, moving on from that data collection piece, you've got the report out of the calculator. Now you're sitting there thinking, what do I actually do with these results? So the interpretation and management is where you start making these changes on the farm to make a difference towards achieving net zero. This is the graph I was talking about earlier with yield. So it shows really nicely how you can optimise for yield and also for carbon. You can express your greenhouse gas emissions either by hectare or by tonne. But realistically, the end consumer is going to want to know by tonne how many greenhouse gas emissions are associated with this produce. So again, yield is really, really crucial in this. I'm just showing you where, in terms of Andrew Ward's data in the drills, where we did last spring, how that varies across the site. So I put an average line in there, which is the UK's average spring barley greenhouse gas emissions per tonne of production. And that sits around 320 kilograms of CO2e per tonne. You can see some of the drills are sitting below that average line, some of them just above. Everything was treated the same in this trial, apart from two things in terms of carbon, which was the drills and the yield at the end. So those two things are what's affecting the differences in the greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see where you have a lower yield, you're naturally going to have higher greenhouse gas emissions than where you do have a higher yield, which the yield is shown by that red line there. Now, Andrew's old system, I hope you'll get the pointer right, but Andrew's old system over here, where he has 34 litres a hectare, where he's used the subsoiler and the Simba free flow. If he does manage to cut this down by 30% and also reduce the weight on the front of the tractor, you can just start to see the impact that would have over time on your greenhouse gas emissions. It would bring you even further below the average. Currently it's just sitting on the average line, but it would bring you below this average line. Also, the weight will have a massive impact. If that's minimising soil compaction over time, that's going to have a massive impact on nitrous oxide emissions from the soil as well. So these two things, these changes that Andrew's making, could actually massively, although he's already below this average line, bring him even further down. So where are these emissions coming from? So this data from the trial we put into one of ADAS's tools, which was using the greenhouse gas inventory to create standardised equations and figures on things like diesel usage per litre, the greenhouse gas emissions per litre of diesel, and also looking at crop residues, nitrogen usage, nitrogen manufacturing, crop protection. So this pie chart shows where these emissions are coming from, and this is a traditional arable system as an average. It's not particularly relevant to what Andrew's doing, but it's relevant to an average UK arable system. Now, you can see some of them, like crop protection, actually contributes to about 4% of greenhouse gas emissions. It's actually quite minimal, and that surprises a lot of people. So going into the details of every single active ingredient you've used on the farm, actually in total it's only going to add up to 4% of your complete emissions. Now the bit we should be focusing on here is the nitrogen. So when we start pulling this apart, 65% of these emissions are coming from nitrogen manufacturing and the application. Now manufacturing, a lot of people debate about why am I accounting for the nitrogen manufacturing emissions when the manufacturer themselves should be accounting for that. You know, in all reality, there's no standard set on who should be accounting for that at the moment, but what I advise people is do account for it in your footprint, because that's then the worst case scenario. If in time it does say that we don't have to account for it, we can always eliminate that. The application bit is the bit that we'll focus on today, because that's the bit that you can directly affect on your farm. And 45% of these emissions come from the application of nitrogen. There's both direct and indirect emissions, but any nitrogen losses isn't good for both greenhouse gas emissions and also economically. So, how do we reduce this? The main losses in the nitrogen cycle. There are three main ways that nitrogen can leave this cycle and therefore not be taken up by the crop. So, as an example, we have denitrification, and denitrification increases where, for example, you've got a wet, moist or waterlogged soil. The reason being is that's quite an aerobic process to make nitrogen available for the crop. If you've got waterlogged soils, it then turns anaerobic. So you're encouraging an anaerobic type of biology, which is actually creating more nitrous oxide. And that's, remember, the bad, potent greenhouse gas that we are trying to reduce. So that denitrification is something we want to try and cut out as much as we can. And the way we do that is by having good soil conditions and also by minimising how waterlogged our soils are and for how long. We also have volatilisation, which is the ammonia losses from urea or AN, for example. And then finally that leaching process. Now that leaching process is something, again, that's directly related to water and something we want to be minimising. So I put in an example here from some work that we've been doing with ADAS as part of their Yen Zero project. This is looking just particularly at nitrous oxide emissions. So this year, or last year it was, we put 4 farmers into the project to look at where are their main nitrous oxide emissions coming from in this instance. And this is broken down between organic and inorganic sources of nitrogen. Organic being, in this case, examples being broiler litter and also food waste digestate. Looking particularly, I'm not going to go into the details of organics today because it is a very interesting area, and ADAS are looking much more into it this year because there's a lot of confusion around the use of organic manures and how bad is it for our greenhouse gas and our carbon footprint. Actually, in reality, it's a very sustainable source of nutrition because you're utilising waste that's already in the system as a resource to provide nutrition to the crop. However, when we're talking around the application of inorganic fertilisers, using this as a specific example, we have a difference here of 20 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare difference. Now, not a huge difference, but you can see a massive jump in the greenhouse gas emissions per hectare between the two. The main reason being is due to the rainfall at these two sites. So this blue line here is showing the rainfall between Bishop Burton and East Worley Hill, which is in Darlington. very different levels of rainfall. And the first question I always get back from that is, that's great, but what am I going to do about the rainfall in my area? It's not something I can directly affect, unfortunately. My main point here being, again, coming back to this nitrous oxide emissions,